Jolly wasn't a close friend of mine, but I met him 4 times and we spent hours together. And I was extraordinarily pleased when his assistant at UCLA Medical School said, Jolly keeps 2 books on his desk. One of them is the Bible. The other is a piece of blue sky. And through the day, he'll sit there and open it randomly and read a paragraph and laugh, And
so just to fill people in, A Piece of Blue Sky is Jon's quite brilliant book about cult dynamics and Scientology in particular. Tell us quickly about Jolly West. Like, who is he? Just people never heard that name. Who's Jolly West? Jolly West
was a psychiatrist. He was the head of neuropsychiatry, I think it was, and biobehavior at UCLA Med School. He's famous for various reasons. He killed an elephant with LSD, an elephant called Tusco. He didn't mean to. No. And he was very sorry afterwards, especially as he had to pay for the cost of the elephant, And it would appear, and Tom O'Neill, I think, does have a reasonable argument to say it was a front group from the CIA that paid for the dead elephant. So there you go. He was a notable researcher into drugs. And the reason he comes into the Manson story is that in 1967, he ran a crash pad in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, the center of the Summer of Love, and invited hippies who were tripping on LSD to come in and sit down while his graduate students made little notes about them and funny comments. And Manson spent 14 months studying Scientology. He had 150 hours of Scientology processing. He read Hubbard books. And this information comes from Manson's autobiography. So he talks about it, but also from internal documents that were seized by the FBI in the largest raid in their history, which was on Scientology in 1977. Now, I thought these documents were known. In fact, in A Piece of Blue Sky in 1990, I wrote, Charles Manson had 150 hours of auditing, and nobody made any noise about it or got upset about it. Because I've got these documents, which are internal reports to Ron Hubbard's wife, Mary Sue Hubbard, who was the controller of Scientology's Guardian's office. And a month before the Manson trial started, which was July 1970, on the 22nd of June, a long report is sent to Mary Sue Hubbard saying, whoops, Manson did Scientology. We've got to keep this from the press. What's more, 3 other members of the family did Scientology. Scientology teaches 2,000 techniques of control, 2,000 ways of controlling people, and it's quite open about it. Hubbard talks about having infinite control, having the intention to control people. And their whole thing about their upper levels, the operating theta levels, is that you will be able to intend things to happen. You will have magical powers. And so that's where I started from. Since then, I've read Tex Watson's book. He led the murders at the Tate and La Bianca houses. I've read Gwyn's book. I've reread Manson's book. I'm just finishing this one, which is, here we go. Member of the family, Diane Lake.
Member of the family.
Yeah, she was 14 years old when Manson recruited her. And her own parents had basically said this was fine because they'd become hippies. And, she, is cast adrift into this, what at first is a peace and love cult. You've got to destroy your ego and love everybody. And eventually is a murder and mayhem group. She was not involved in any of the killings, but she was a witness for many years during the various trials that eventuated. By reading these books and looking at Susan Atkins and Lynette Fromm's books, also members of the family, to somebody who has studied Scientology, it's very obvious just how much Charles Manson was using the techniques of Scientology. So if we start with the famous Manson stare, yes, he did training routine 0. How to stare at people, how to confront people, how to get locked on eye contact with people. So that thing which is almost the first thing that people think of with Manson, that, staring people down, came from there. And Scientology, he talks about the transformation in his life through Scientology, that he now knew how to lead. He now knew how to take charge of people. So whether it's the most relevant thing, it's certainly incredibly relevant that he was, engaging in these things. He later on will use Scientology words. So in Diane Lake's book, she suddenly starts talking about him teaching them about postulates. And this is only Scientology uses the word in the way to mean basically a wish, a demand of the world that it should comply. She uses that word nearly 20 times in her book. So to her is very significant. Tex Watson talks about, and this one I'm having difficulty with, he talks about Charlie Manson saying they all had to be deprogrammed. I have difficulty with it because I don't think the word was in the language in 1968, 69. First use I can find is 1973. So I think Tex Watson. But the basic idea that he was saying, you're all hypnotized and I'm going to de-hypnotize you, that's a fundamental idea of Scientology. And when people say that, you need to be a little bit cautious. A cult is, by definition, a group that reveres a particular leader or doctrine. So if you're obedient to somebody, then you're in a cultic relationship. Whether it calls itself a religion, a psychotherapy, or just a partnership, that is a cultic relationship. What I'm working on at the moment, I'm working on a book proposal for a book about belief. And Manson will be a big fat chapter in there, because looking at what's been said, I can show step by step exactly how his followers were indoctrinated, exactly what he did, within the purview of somebody who has studied authoritarian groups for 40 years. And of course, that makes me, I have a very different perspective to a journalist about that. And so there have been some excellent journalists, Tom O'Neill, Jeff Gwynne, they're really good at what they do. But to understand what they're looking at, you need a specialized knowledge. And Manson pulls together the tricks that he'd learned as a pimp, which of course are ways of controlling, in his case, the women. So he learned how to recruit women. And it's very simple. He used love bombing. He would find a relatively plain looking girl and go up to her and say, "You are so beautiful." And I'd like to say, Andrew, that you too are very beautiful. I'm in awe of your beauty, Andrew.
Are you being Charles or John?
Yeah. Anybody who is bringing people to act against their best interests, that's a cultic relationship, plain and simple. It's not necessarily a cult, but...
What are some of the things then? So love bombing's one of them. What are some of the things he was using on these women, Charles Manson was using on these women, that are straight from the Scientology playbook? Aside from this, so we've got the stare, there's love bombing, of course, which is typical of many cults. Is there anything else quite specific like that?
Yeah. Several people talk about him changing hats, and that's the expression he used. Now, what they mean by this is that he could switch personae. He could offer up a completely different person in a moment. Now, this would come from what's called tone scale drilling in Scientology, where you learn to mimic emotions, so that you can control other people emotionally, so that you can make them feel better or you can make them feel worse. And I must say, I never took to the idea of making people feel worse. That seemed wrong to me, so I didn't do it. But it's a technique that's used to recruit people, that you make them feel worse and worse about themselves, their fear of worsening, and bring them to do something. The changing hats, the term hat was used by Hubbard to mean superficially a job, but more deeply a personality, a beingness, as he called it. He liked adding ness to the end of things. For some reason, he loved making words up. 2 600-page dictionaries full of nonsense. But so we have him again using the term hat, but that he would switch personalities according to who he was talking to. And of course, he had a fairly he hung out with some pretty celebrated people. Dennis Wilson, the drummer with the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys recorded a Charles Manson song. And Charles Manson was very upset because they changed the lyrics in the title. The song was originally called Cease to Exist. He also hung out with Terry Melcher, perhaps not a well-known name anymore, but he was Doris Day's son, the major film star of the 40s and 50s. And he was one of the most wanted record producers, because he'd produced Mr. Tambourine Man for the Byrds. And apparently he told 4 of them that they couldn't play on it because they were rubbish, so he put session men in. Sorry about that. If David Crosby is watching this, it's nothing personal, but Roger McGuinn was the only person who could actually play, according to Melcher. Terry Melcher, his girlfriend...
I always thought it was Bob Dylan.
Oh, he wrote it, but there was the huge international hit was The Byrds. And that's instead of, hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, you've got a bloke who can sing. Terry Melcher lived with Candice Bergen, the film star. Yeah. And one of the recruits of the family was the daughter of Angela Lansbury. Very briefly, thankfully. But so he was hanging out with the Hollywood set and doing all of that. In terms of other techniques, there's a specific technique that we know he did in prison, because when Scientology investigated, they found the guy who had done all of this stuff with him over 14 months, a man called Lania Raymer. And he was in prison, according to Scientology's account, he was in prison because he'd failed to rob a bank. And the reason he tried to rob a bank was to get enough money to do Scientology. One of the techniques that he did is called space hand mimicry. And it's part of a set of techniques which are called the control communication havingness processes. And I'm falling asleep at this already myself. And that's part of the objective as opposed to subjective processes. Now, what you do with space hand mimicry, and Manson did this to the people around him all the time, to his followers, you put your hand up, or both hands, and then the person is meant to follow the movement of your hands. And which seems simple enough until you go and talk to a hypnotist about it. And they say, oh, that's called pacing. You know, there are other ways of doing it, like following somebody's breathing or following their gestures. In the Dead Poets Society, Robin Williams has the kids walk around the quadrangle and they fall into lockstep. And that's what he's trying to show them, that people will naturally pace. They will come under control physically and psychologically by mimicry. So repetition, fixation, and mimicry. That's my shorthand for anybody watching. That those are 3 ways of getting people into states where they can be more easily controlled and where they will often feel euphoric. States called trance states by some people. Scientology uses all of them. Repetition, fixation, mimicry. So the mimicry technique was something he did. And he then added to this by giving people, they'd have weekly LSD sessions, which usually turned into sexual orgies, where Manson would tell people who they were going to have sex with. Tex Watson was an all-American boy. He was an athlete. He'd done very well in school. There's nothing in his background to suggest problems. He then had a good job and earned good money. And he twice left the Manson family, the second time for 3 months, but was pulled back by something that appealed to him. And I think, you know, one of the other reasons that people join cults is that they look at the world, see how corrupt it is, and really want to do something about it. And somebody comes along and says, we know how to change the world. And, you know, they find themselves following Adolf Hitler or, you know, L. Ron Hubbard or somebody. And I mean, there's another thing I think is very important about recruitment, and that is that we all have our own habits and routines. And if you can disorganize somebody's habits, then you can give them new ones. You know, this is the idea of unfreezing, changing, and refreezing, which is the simplest view of thought reform, Edgar Schein's view. And there are particular points of vulnerability as well. The teens, and when you get to around my age, the prime recruiting periods are the first term of college. You've gone away from home, you're in a new environment, you've got new people around you. That's why so many campuses prohibit cult groups on the campus. But the point is that, as with the Moonies, they've got 2,000 different names. They'll just invent a new one and come along and say, "Hi, would you like to come away for 3 days? You look fantastic. Andrew, you look great. You've got no chocolate milk on your face at all." You can be both a crank and a charlatan. And I think that with Manson and with Hubbard, that their self-belief, that a part of the problem was that they did not believe themselves. They knew they were bad people, and they knew that they were working a scam, but they also did believe in what they were doing. So Hubbard, at the very end, guy who was with him called Serge Fouth, so reported in Lawrence Wright's very good book, Going Clear. Serge Fouth, Hubbard turned to him and said, "I want you to make me an electrometer," the device, lie detector used in Scientology, "that will kill me. I have failed completely. I have not achieved anything." And I interviewed people. The earliest was a woman who was with him in 1950, who was his girlfriend, Barbara Cloden. But then over the years, I interviewed people who were with him at different times, and they'd all got this story that in private, he would collapse and he'd say, "I'm a failure." There are stories of his wife, Mary Sue Hubbard, having furious rows with him when they were on board ship in the Mediterranean, saying, "You're a charlatan, you're a fraud." His own wife, who helped him maintain the whole thing and went to prison so that he wouldn't have to. So I think Manson believed what he was teaching, and what he was teaching, again, there doesn't seem to be any simple statement of this in the literature. But so his basic idea was this thing, helter-skelter, that the blacks would rise up, defeat the white oppressors, and meanwhile, Charlie Manson and the family would have found what he called the bottomless pit, and apparently none of his followers knew that this is a reference to hell. That strange mixture that you often find with cult leaders, that people look at them and call them geniuses. They think they're really smart, but they aren't. They're cunning. They're very good at reading other people and seeing how they feel and how they respond, and then changing hats, then becoming the personality that will appeal to that. Hubbard was not a deeply educated man, having studied his life. He read a load of Pulp Fiction, cheap manuals on hypnosis, and whatever he could get about magic and Aleister Crowley. There's no deep study involved. He doesn't know any philosophy. Everything that he says about philosophy comes from Will Durant's Story of Philosophy, from a single book. And he actually dedicated his book Dianetics, The Mental Science of Modern Health, as I like to think of it, was originally dedicated to Will Durant, because that's where he'd learned all his philosophy from. You don't need to waste time getting a doctorate. You just read this one book and everything. You'll be able to then tell your followers all about Schopenhauer and Kant and Nietzsche, from the pages of one book. Same thing is actually said about James Joyce, that he read one book about philosophy, but he made great use of it to confuse people into thinking he was brilliant. It's actually, he was brilliant though, in his case, whereas Ron Hubbard wasn't, and Charlie Manson wasn't. Manson himself says he didn't learn to read and write until he was 27 in McNeil Island Penitentiary. This is not true. And it's one of the things we have to be careful of with such people, because believe it or not, they sometimes tell lies. What is true is that Manson's reading skills were not very developed until he started at McNeil Island studying Scientology, and he wanted to read Scientology books, and he did.
Has Scientology publicly denied, have they moved to cover up that Manson had been a fervent member, in a sense?
Oh, yeah. A few weeks ago, my friend Steve Hassan, PhD, let's add that, he writes a column for Psychology Today, and because Leslie Van Houten was about to be released, he wrote about the control issues and the extent to which we could consider her responsible for her actions or not. diminished responsibility, as it's called in law. And I think diminished responsibility is certainly an aspect of this case. And the idea that this poor woman had been, apprehended, I think, in December 1969, and here we are, 50 whatever years later, and she's still in prison. That does seem, rather draconian, but understandable given the horrible nature of the killings. But because that had come up, Steve wrote his piece for Psychology Today, and he said, and Charles Manson had 150 hours of auditing. And let me point out that in my 9 years, I didn't have that much. So this is a lot. This is, and so he put that in, and immediately Psychology Today got a complaint saying, and they sent them a copy of a newspaper article from The Guardian in 1971, which talked about somebody having withdrawn the libel that Charles Manson had been involved with Scientology. And this was proof. Psychology Today folded. The same day, I sent them the actual internal directive with the 150 hours in and said, I'm an expert witness on Scientology, which means that what I say may be considered factual. The High Court appointed me an expert witness in 1987.